Good evening, everyone. Come on in. Great to see everybody tonight. We're very glad that you're here. It's been a full day for us all, and we hope it's been a good day for you. We are sure thankful that we can share the evening together. Welcome to our Bible study. We have found a way to get Ken Pridgeon back in here on a Wednesday night. How's that? I tell you what, this guy has been an absolute rock star for our church family. He's been down and out, and we're really thankful you're back where you ought to be. We saved your seat, Mr. Ken. Before we turned the cameras on, we'd run people out. We didn't want to broadcast that, but we're glad to see you back tonight. And your shotgun rider too, Miss Carolyn. We're glad that they're here. We're glad that you're here. We're really thankful that we can have the evening and have the time to share together. And we hope that you'll be encouraged by our time and our study. We're diving back into Acts, the 27th chapter, and this is really a very special segment of the book. So the book of Acts seems to, by history, or at least by seems to end rather abruptly. We'll talk about that when we get to that point in time, or when that period of our study comes up too, even though it's coming toward the end, because you're seeing so much of God's providence unfold within the life of Paul, and you're seeing how he is purposing Paul's peril in order to bring about the preaching of the gospel. And it really is tremendous when you stop and think about it. I think it serves as a beautiful framework for our own lives when we encounter hardship or difficulty, circumstances that we would just as soon not experience or not go through. We can see on the other side of those experiences or the other side of those circumstances perhaps some of the reason and rationale why those things were there and why we endured or needed to endure as we did. And so looking at those concepts, we back up just a little bit to not to recap entirely, but just to reset the stage for where we are in the text. We're setting sail in Acts 27. We'll encounter the perfect storm in Acts 27, verses 14 through 44, and that's where we'll really pick up this evening. And then if we get into chapter 28, we'll look at the time that they spend on what we've dubbed Survivor Island, and then Paul's eventual opportunity when he reaches Rome, and the events and the circumstances that unfold there. So we come back to Acts 27 where he has set sail again. We covered most of this last Wednesday night, so we'll not necessarily unpack all of it once again, but just to set the stage, when they were leaving in Acts 27, preparing to sail to Rome, remember Paul's in this prolonged prisoner transfer, and so this is unfolding over the course of quite some time. When it was decided that they would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. They then embarked on an Adramyttian ship which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia. They put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. They spent the next day at Sidon, and then Julius treated Paul with consideration, allowed him to go see his friends, receive care from them as they're preparing for this voyage. Remember, we've seen Paul seen Paul receive a lot of undue treatment and harsh and cruel treatment, but in the midst of all of those moments, Paul's received a lot of consideration and a lot of regard, a lot of latitude as a prisoner, and it's due in large part, at least my speculation and observation would be, of Paul's character and the nature of his demeanor throughout all of those circumstances and encounters. So we're following their voyage as they're setting out to sea. They go in verses 4 through 8. From there they go to sea. They sail under the shelter of Cyprus. The winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, they landed at Myra in Lycia. There a centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy. He put us aboard it. When they sailed slowly for a good many days, with difficulty they arrived to Secundus. Since the wind did not permit us to sail any further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salome. And then with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So here, right in the center of your screen, you'll see where Paul and Luke really is recording this segment of their travel, and how it is that moment really becomes a pivotal time, and whether they decide to go forward or stay or remain, and what unfolds in the next few verses is significant. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, there's a mention here of the fast that's being observed by those who would have certainly had part and portion in the fast in Acts 27. This is a significant period of time, and again, Luke is capturing this detail which to us would seem to be a really insignificant or meaningless in many regards, but to the audience reading that with their religious background, particularly with a Jewish background, this would be significant to them. The text says, verse 9, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Paul speaks up and gives some concern and gives some hesitation here. Think about, I don't have it referenced here on the screen, but just think about Paul's recounting circumstances in his own life, particularly in the letter that he writes to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. If you want to reference that sometime, observe when Paul is starting to recount all the number of times he had endured hardship. And he speaks about the number of times he had been shipwrecked in his life. Surely, in recounting those moments to the church at Corinth, he's reflecting on perhaps one of these instances or occasions. But you also will think about the other times that Paul was shipwrecked. Scripture and the text of the Bible don't always reference those times or those moments. So there are these other scenarios and scenes in Paul's life that he experiences that we don't have access to, but he knows about them and he recounts them for us. Here in this passage, I think you see Paul leaning on the intuition he has developed because of those experiences. This is very different from his warning that he will give a little later in this scene and in this text, because here he's relying on his own intuition. He's relying on his observation. I perceive, or I really think that this voyage is going to not go well. We're going to suffer great loss if we go on from this point here. And so Paul is giving his best observation from his experience having been at sea. Paul says, I'm not sure that we should be sailing. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Now, to the centurion's credit, or in defense of the centurion, Paul is not known for being a sailor, but Paul has had experience at sea. And so even in Paul's experience at sea, the centurion, I think, does what most all of us would have done, not knowing Paul beyond this context and circumstance. We defer to the so-called experts in the room, all right? What does the captain have to say? What does the pilot have to say? Some translations might read in Acts 27 and 11, some translations might read owner. So the captain of the ship was really the one that was in charge of the vessel, could have even been the one that owned the vessel. And the pilot was the one who may have been more in the role of that of a traditional captain, giving the orders or setting the tone of the ship, if you will. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete close inshore. So their goal is to go further down the Isle of Crete, to land really, if you will, on the other side or further up Crete, so that the winter would be easier to endure there, that it would be easier for them to spend or harbor their ship there. Now, they set out on this journey believing that that's going to be the right thing to do. However, Paul's intuition turns out to be the absolute admonition that they should have heeded. However, they ignore it. But here the text unfolds what this perfect storm in life begins to look like. And it's really fascinating when you stop and see it through the lens of providential care. And I hope that's how you've been seeing these last few chapters, particularly Paul's times in prison, chapters 23, 24, 25, 26, and all of the circumstances that unfold. And now these chapters where his travel is being in perspective or being placed in perspective, how that God's care is so profound, it's so imminent in his life. It really is quite remarkable. So, picking up in verse 14. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Araquello. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. So this violent wind arises. It is a known wind, if you will, if you can consider it like we would consider some weather systems, El Nino or El Niña. We think about some weather systems that occur with frequency or at least with regularity that we're familiar with them. This is one of those types of weather systems, if you will. They have named it. They have this notion of here's where it typically occurs and here's what you typically encounter. They weigh anchor in order to help stabilize the boat, or at least to keep them on some kind of trajectory and course in order to make their way to their destination. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. This was for all passengers on board moving from bad to worse. They did not see the circumstance or the scenario here improving with any significance, and they just saw themselves in this deteriorating circumstance, this deteriorating condition, and they did not believe any good would come from these moments. Now, you don't have to be on a literal boat, but just in the boat of life, can you picture this as a moment of your life ever unfolding? That the circumstances just seem to be, no matter what it is you're doing by your own hand, going from bad to worse to how did I wind up here? I mean, it's just that constant deterioration. And you see this through the lens of life, and it really takes on a remarkable metaphor for how life can, through our own efforts and particularly in spite of our own efforts, just spiral out of control to a place where we're about ready to abandon hope. It's one thing to deal with people who are helpless, who feel helpless, like there's nothing that they can do, or whatever they try to do, they're not able to do it with any type of success or any type of energy or vitality. It's one thing to deal with people who feel helpless. It's another thing to deal with people who feel hopeless. If you feel helpless, we can try and figure out some of the things that we're doing. If you feel hopeless, you think, what's the use? I mean, just give this thing up. There's no purpose in me going on any further. It's all going south. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss." Well, thank you, Paul. Well, I mean, this is a lot of help right now, don't you think? So, okay, here's a couple of things. Number one, I would caution, I'm very eager to think of this as what kind of moment would you call this in Paul's life? Say it again. A "see, I told you so" kind of moment, right? I try to be somewhat cautious in seeing this moment as a "see, I told you so" kind of moment, because I'm not certain that's exactly where Paul went. Remember, Paul perceived what about this journey? What did he perceive? This is going to be tough, and I really have a. How could you say it in a different way? I have a gut feeling this is not going to go well. Now, is there anything inspired about gut feelings? Well, we don't know. Huh? We don't know. It could, maybe, and you could be hungry. We don't know. We don't know in all circumstances, in all cases, in all conditions, in all moments, where this gut feeling is coming from. But by the text, and I'll show you here in just a moment, by the text reveals this was Paul's way of thinking. This was not anything of inspiration. I perceive, is what Paul said. Friends, I don't know how to tell you this, but I just don't have a good feeling about this trip. Okay, Captain, what do you have to say? Captain says, let's do it. Pilot, what do you have to say? Pilot says, let's do it. All right, pilot and the captain are good. Everybody else good. Everybody else seems to be good. Paul, thanks for your concern. We're going to go ahead. So I have a hard time seeing this as Paul saying, "See, I told you so. Shouldn't you have listened to me?" Yeah, I think you should have. Because Paul was concerned about this trip. So remember, there's been some days passed by here. People have been very desperate. They've been throwing their cargo overboard. They've been throwing their tackle overboard. They have been without sun for days. They have been without moon and stars for days. They have been in peril for days. This text also gives you a clue that Paul was not immune to fear. Paul didn't like being in this circumstance. How come? Well, Paul tells the church at Corinth, look, I've been shipwrecked. It's no cakewalk. I don't like it. It's not fun. I think Luke is preserving for us Paul's humanity in this respect. This was not a pleasant experience. So Paul speaks up. So I'm not convinced that this is Paul saying, "See, I told you so." But I mean, it's coming across that way. I'm not denying that in any regard. And if under other circumstances, if maybe my life weren't being threatened, I might be willing to, strut around and gloat. But remember, they're still on a ship that they think is not going to make it. "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet, now I urge you, keep your courage." Here it comes. "For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. How did Paul give his warning before they set sail? I perceive. How is he giving the information now? I have been told. I think there is lesson for us. Sometimes there are things that we think in this world are things we should or should not engage in or avoid or take our time and our pause and our hesitancy from getting entangled with those things. There are some things that we perceive, this may or may not be a good idea. But brethren, we need to be very honest. There are some things that we have been clearly told, you need to stay away from that. You don't need to do that. Or you go ahead and you do this because God has said, I will provide for you. How do we know that? Well, He said He'll provide for us in a lot of circumstances. You speak my name, I'll provide for you. You confess me before men, I'll confess you before the Father. You be faithful to me, I'll give you a crown of life. There's that concept that says you do these things and God has confirmed this is going to be okay. It's not going to be error or difficulty free, but it's going to be okay. I'll provide for you. So Paul here draws the distinction. Now he's not saying you need to listen to me. Now he's saying you need to listen to the God I serve. This is a reason why. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. It's going to work out, but it's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be without difficulty, but no life will be lost. Questions or observations or comments or thoughts as we pass through this storm? Go for it, Mr. Ken.
Do you see Paul in chains? And is he as a prisoner? Is he in chains, or is he running around loose?
Mr. Ken asked, is Paul in chains or is he running around loose? Remember, there are other prisoners being transported on this ship as well, Mr. Ken, and some of those prisoners may have been in chains, but up to this point, Paul has been given a pretty good amount of latitude and freedom that has not been extended to the other prisoners. So on the ship, to answer your question, I think, yes, there are men who are in chains. We'll see that indicated in the idea of how they get to shore when we get to that place. But then for Paul, I think he's probably given a greater reign of freedom even moving about the ship. Yes, sir. Great question. Other question. Go for it, Wes.
When Paul was talking, I perceive he's very vague.
Yes. I got a feeling. Yeah.
But God gave very specific.
There you go.
And that just gives so much credibility to God.
Wes brings up that idea that Paul is saying, I don't feel good about this, but I really don't know what to tell you what I'm feeling. I just don't feel good about it. But when it comes to the assurance, God comes in with these details, and God comes in with the specifics. It's going to be okay because of these things. Is that not always the reality with God? There's always certainty with Him, and there's always speculation with ourselves. Great observation. Mr. Richard.
At the very beginning, it seems like he's starting out, and he's not. It sounds like I'm just thinking, so to speak, that he feels like.
I'm glad somebody is, Mr. Richard. I mean,
he's putting his hands in somebody that's not godly, so to speak.
Mm.
And so he's kind of like, oh, I don't know about this, I don't know. But now it's kind of like, I know for sure, because now we're in God's hands, and we know for sure.
Yeah, Mr. Richards observing that hesitancy on Paul's part, it may have been prompted by the company he's keeping. These are not all God-fearing people. And so I'm not sure how this will turn out, but now God has given me the assurance. And there, again, is another indication of that shift. Absolutely. Well, keep going in the text. Again, it's just a fantastic passage. But when the 14th night came, and hey, listen, what's the longest we've been without power around here during some of these hurricanes and storms, right? 5 nights, 6 nights, 7 nights, 10 nights, 12, 14 nights. I mean, you think about this. When the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be about 15 fathoms. A fathom was generally around 120 feet, and so they're measuring this out. How close are we to land? Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished, look at this, verse 29, and wished for daybreak. Now again, just stop and think about this. You don't have to be tossed about on a literal boat in a literal sea. But how many dark nights have you endured just wanting to see the sunrise? Or just thinking, if I can just get through the night and the sun comes up. And the sun comes up. I mean, you think about the hope. Even in pagan people, they want to see the sun. Even pagan people want to see the light. It is so profound when you stop and consider it. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat, or the skiff, if you will, into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Paul is laying it down. Why? Because he was told, here's how my Lord intends to accomplish this. Everyone must remain on the ship. And Paul gives this word to the centurions. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat, the skiff, and let it fall away. Guys, I don't have a good feeling about going out to sea with this travel. Well, we're going to go anyway. And now they're out there, and Paul says, well, I really wish you would have listened to me, but now my God says we're going to be okay so long as we all remain on this ship. Everyone will be spared. These guys are trying to escape, and Paul says to the centurion, unless you all remain, we'll perish. And how do they intervene and respond to Paul? They cut the lifeboat. Okay. You want to talk about faith in action? We're going to cut the lifeboat. We're cutting the lifeboat. When would the lifeboat have typically been used? I don't know, maybe in a scenario like this. You probably would have thought that'd be a good idea. You can control it more easily. You have a chance of survival. Nope, cut the lifeboat. It's phenomenal when you stop and think of it. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Wish I'd been there. And so, when you think about what he's saying, it's really fantastic. Hey, they've not eaten, but what is about to happen, they're going to need their strength. In fact, they're going to need energy to sustain them for what they're about to go through. And Paul takes this moment, you should eat. And then there's this, having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and when they themselves also took food, all of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. Another aspect of this trust in Paul. Who's running this ship now? God's running this ship through Paul. I mean, Paul has all of a sudden gained all of their trust, and he has proven himself to be not only worthy of the trust, but he's proven himself to be effective in his engagement through this time. He is that calm, steady hand in this moment. He's been in the same kind of peril that they have been in, and it's just been phenomenal to see him maneuver through this. Questions or other comments or observations? All right, here's Survivor Island. So we're making it to Malta. This will be the miracle at Malta. And why is that the case? Well, ultimately, all right, so can you see the area that's labeled the Mediterranean Sea? Yes, no, maybe. I mean, you see that area. That's roughly 300 or so square miles of sea. That's a pretty decent amount of water. Yes, no, maybe. I mean, that's a good area of water. Malta was an island. Watch this. Malta was an island about 17 miles long and 9 miles wide. And you're dropping Malta into a 300 square mile area of water. And of all the places that this ship lost at sea will find its resting place, it's on a speck. It's those circumstances when you look back and you say, but you know, this person was there, and then this person came, and someone I never met was there, and then they brought someone else, and all of a sudden, I've got the help I need. And you're astounded. How are they going to find Malta? Well, they find Malta because that's exactly where the Lord wants them to land. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. Here again, here's another item just for your curiosity, if you're so inclined. Verse 40. If you want to think about the precision of the text, I think this is incredible. There was a period of time in the seafaring vessels of the first century, and for a good period of time, that they employed the use of multiple rudders. It wasn't until some time later that the use of a single rudder was employed in seafaring vessels. The fact that Luke records the plural is just it's another element of not only his accuracy, but once more, the beauty of the inspiration of the text. We're going to leave nothing that would be suspect to say, well, you wrote this well after, or this was created after these. No. This is a first-hand accounting of these events. It's really incredible. Striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. And the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, who would the rest be? Those who couldn't swim. How are they going to survive? That they should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. So if the ship had not run aground and broken into pieces, what happens to the people who can't swim? Why is the ship breaking to pieces? Why is this happening? You think about all of the way these things unfold in the manner that they do. It's phenomenal how God continues to provide. Here's the other thing. Why did those prisoners find their lives spared? Because of one prisoner who happened to be a child of God. I'll say this too. If ever you need evidence for why the lives of people in the world could and should and oftentimes are made better because of the lives of God's people in the world, look to Acts 27 and 28. The lives of God's people in the world should make the lives of those who are not God's people in this world at that moment better, because our lives are in this world. Why were those prisoners spared? Because of one prisoner named Paul. That's why their lives were spared. Why were the lives of everyone on the ship spared? Because of one prisoner named Paul. Do not underestimate your influence and how much better you may be making someone's life in this world without Christ because you have Christ and they don't. Now, that is not the measure of their salvation. You know that and I know that. But here again, if they had done anything contrary than what God said to do, they would not have been saved. There's another lesson for your salvation. How am I going to be spared? I'll tell you how you're not going to be spared. You're not going to be spared by coming up with the way that you think you should be saved in light of what God has said you must do to be saved. That's how you won't be spared. But the world around us says, no, you don't have to do this or that or believe this or believe that. Well, I don't know. Talk to the centurion who was guarding all the prisoners on the ship and they were about to flee on the lifeboat. And you say, hey, if they leave, we all die. And they cut the lifeboat. Why? Because you can come up with a plan to be saved all you want. But when God says this is how you'll be saved, that's how you'll be saved. Period. The text is so remarkable about these items that you think they're slid in here. And it's so fantastic when you see them. So, they're now writing on the ship pieces, those who cannot swim, in order that they can find their way to land. Acts 28. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness. For because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. You think about the stories that unfold when people have been in harm's way or in way of need, and others have taken them in, many times taking them in as strangers. When we endured a massive historic flood in Middle Tennessee in 2010, May of 2010, Connor was in the first grade, and he was concerned because they canceled school, and in fact they called off school for the rest of the year. It was early in May 5th. They called off school. They had about 3 weeks left. There's no way to hold school again. I mean, this is it. You know, I'm not going to finish the first grade. I'll be in first grade the rest of my life. And so this is really devastating. We had people passing through that area. There was such horrendous rainfall and torrential rains. Folks were passing through that area, and the church was positioned on top of a hill in that area, in that region, just above the Duck River that runs through much of Hickman County. And so those who were passing through just stop at the church because it's up on the hill. It became a safe haven for them for just about a week because they could not pass through going to the west or to the east or to the north or to the south. We were landlocked because of the floodwaters. And until they receded and until many of the roads were repaired, they couldn't leave. We had Avis truck drivers who were camping with us. We had individuals who were stranded there passing through the area because they were diverted from the interstate staying with us. And we took them in. We had Red Cross workers who were stranded with us, and we became an aid to them because they couldn't get to where they needed to be. You think about how these moments are so profound to people who find themselves in need, and it means absolutely everything to them because up to this moment they thought all hope is lost. And then hope appears in the form of an absolute and total stranger. And their hope is rekindled. Maybe it can be that if you allow the language, maybe it could be that in someone's life, you are their miracle at their Malta. Maybe it is that when you encounter them, your kindness or your engagement or your help or your willingness becomes their oasis of safe haven because up to that moment they believed all hope was lost. I pray that when you look at these last few chapters in the book of Acts, you see more than just a lot of facts and moments unfolding, but you see the mighty hand of God preserving all His intent to advance the message of His Son's saving grace in people's lives. And sometimes He'll even use a storm and a shattered ship to bring about the salvation of those that He wants to hear the name of His Son. You are such a blessing. Drew Slatton ran over here. I mean, he sprinted from the family center to get here to be able to deliver announcements to us. He might even sing them one night. Who knows? I mean, this is the last night. Who knows what we'll get? Drew, we love you. We love you all. God bless you.
Margaret George is in.
A little bit louder. I don't get very hard of hearing.
I'm so used to people telling me to be quiet that. Do I need to read this again? Could you? Yeah, okay, sorry about that. Okay, this is from Josie. Please continue to pray for my nephew, David Salinas. He was rushed to MD Anderson Hospital at the Med Center from MD Anderson in the Woodlands, too sick for any procedures that the Woodland Hospital was going to be able to do. So we'll keep him in our prayers. Margaret George is out of the hospital, or no, not out of the hospital, out of ICU. She's in room 302 at Park Manor. Pretty sure I got that right. Oh, that's Chris George's mother, Margaret George. I had another one, and I can't find it for the life of me. Well, I don't know what it was. Jim's here. He's doing better. Good to see him back up on his feet. Does anyone know of any other announcements that need to be made? Yes.
To share with everybody about our Ed, who will undergo his procedure on Tuesday.
On Tuesday, right. So Ed's gonna be at MD Anderson, going through more or less the same procedure that he already went through, except the other hospital didn't do such a great job. So really pray for Ed come Tuesday, right? Ed, Tuesday, and MD Anderson's pretty good at what they do. So, but we'll keep in our prayers that everything goes well and really are successful in what we're doing this time. Okay. Said I had another one, won't come to me. We are going to have another LTC meeting Sunday morning right after service. I think we've got just about all our ducks in a row. put everything together at that point.
Annie Eubanks grew up at Champions and has moved to California, and some of our people stay in touch with her. She had a baby boy a month ago, and his intestines were not connected. So he was rushed into surgery, and it was not successful. His name is Bowen, B-O-W-E-N, and she has requested that Champions pray for baby Bowen, because they're going to try to do the surgery again.
Everybody hear that? Baby Bo and Annie Eubanks. Annie Eubanks, baby boy Bowen was born, his intestines were not connected. And they are trying to correct that. So far, they've not been able to. So we want to keep baby Bowen in our prayers. All right, if there's nothing else, would you pray with me? Lord, we thank you for this time together. I ask you to be with Bowen and be with the doctors who are taking care of him. We ask you to watch over David Salinas, and again, the doctors who are taking care of him, let their skill be plenty for what is needed to be done. We want to keep Brother Ed in our prayers, and that the doctors at MD Anderson are successful in his upcoming surgery. And we ask you to continue to be with so many who are recovering from surgery or who are fighting cancer and other health issues. Lord, be with all who've lost a loved one recently. Continue to be with Margaret George as she recovers. And Lord, just continue to be with all of us. Help us keep closer to you. Help us wash each other's feet. Help us serve each other. Help us keep each other holy. Help us keep each other focused on you. Lord, go with us through the rest of this week. We thank you for all the many things that you do for us daily, some of which we don't even notice if we're honest about it. Lord, we're so grateful for everything that you do for us. And most of all, we thank you for Jesus and the sacrifice that he gave to us that we might have eternal life with you and with him and with all those who accept his name. It's in his name that we pray all these things. Amen.